Hi, my name is Lucy and I survived sexual abuse as a child. So I'm from a place in England called Suffolk. It's kind of like all countryside. I had a fairly good childhood. My mum has horses, so we'd always be out and about. It was never like children are nowadays where they're stuck on their phones. I didn't really have a great relationship with my father because he was more involved in drinks and things like that. My stepdad, he stepped in and he has been amazing. He's such a good stepdad. So I have two sisters who I love to bits, and my granddad at the time, he passed away. And then my grandmother met this man who technically would have been my step-granddad, I guess. And it was all fine, very happy. He was a really nice man, When the abuse started happening, it was a bit of weird because I was so young. I was 11, and obviously I hadn't really hit puberty. I didn't even know what was, to be honest. I didn't know any of that. My granddad that had passed away, I used to sit on his lap because he had cancer in his leg, so he only had one leg. There was nothing it was just a normal granddaughter and grandparent relationship. But when my step-granddad, he caught on to this, and, as I'm a young child, I'm going to be really excited that someone's going to want to be my granddad. My granddad's passed away, and, it was just nice. But I remember I sat on his lap and he touched my and I didn't really think much of it. I just kind of carried on watching TV, and then he kind of went down my trousers. I just kind of sat there and froze because I knew that wasn't right. My mum doesn't do that. My stepdad doesn't do that. I don't really remember much else of the night because it was a blur, but I just remember coming home, not really speaking to anyone, just getting into bed, putting my head under the pillow and just crying and crying, going, he's a pervert. And thinking back to it, I don't know how I must have known that word, maybe in school. I couldn't sleep. I just cried all night. I felt like it kind of ruined me academically a bit. I struggle in school as it is anyway when I was there because I am dyslexic. That didn't help. And then the next time I went round, because I hadn't told anyone because I was so embarrassed. I was just, oh my God, I don't want to tell my mum. You don't want to even tell your mum about your period, let alone someone touching you. I remember it kind of progressively got a little bit worse, but my mechanism was, I'll just pretend I'm asleep. But that didn't obviously help. That probably made things worse. And I just always had this memory in my head, I was at the beach, and that was playing with my dogs and all of that, and that just used to always get me through. Just kept going on and on and on. He used to take me and my sister swimming. He'd always say, oh, I can't come in the changing with you because men aren't allowed in the changing room. And I used to always find that so weird because I used to think, but you touch me and you're saying you can't come in the changing room, and I felt like that was my little bit of freedom away from him, and I never said anything to my sister about it. It was I kept it to myself because I've always been a very strong person. So I just thought, if I just take this abuse, she'll never have to. We used to go to my great aunt's, and I remember we sat at the table and he had his hands under my trousers, under the table. And I remember just looking at everyone thinking, please, can someone just stop this? Because I couldn't get up. It would just be rude to get up. I've grown up where we have table manners and you don't just get up from the table. I just thought, right, get through this. You're going to be okay. It's fine. I remember I was out playing with my friends and we were riding on our bikes. And I remember I saw him at co-op, and I remember my heart dropping. So I thought, oh my God, he's going to do this, in front of everyone, he's going to touch me. He was like, give me a cuddle, give your granddad a cuddle. And he wasn't my granddad, so it always used to annoy me, but he made me call him granddad, and I just think that was more sick of him. And I'm thinking, oh God. And I gave him a cuddle, and he asked my friend to give him a cuddle as well, which I literally just thought, oh my God. And I just remember watching don't give him a cuddle, and she did, and it was just so, like, it made me feel so sick. But he didn't actually touch me out in public, but he brushed against my bum as he, like, pulled his, and it was just his, you know, way of touching me, and it made me feel so ill. I remember I was over at my friends, and we used to go on Omegle, like, back in the day. We must have been about 14, and we found it hilarious, and we'd sit there and there would just be things that would come up, and I'd feel so uneasy. Everyone knows what old men like to do on Omegle, and it's so uncomfortable for a young girl. And I remember we'd all skip it, and we'd be like screaming like, oh my god. And I think there was this one time where we were sat there, and my friend, like, she didn't mean to, she was joking around. I think she might have tickled me, or like she did something that really set my anxiety off. And I remember just getting up and storming out. And I remember, like, she came over to me and she was like, you can't do that, I did nothing wrong, you can't treat me like that. And obviously she had no idea what was going on in my head. I was like, no, I'm just gonna go home. So I went in, I started packing my stuff, and she went, look, like, just tell me what the problem is, like, please, like, I haven't done anything wrong. And I was like, no, you haven't done anything wrong, but, you know, I don't like people touch me like that. And she was like, but why? Like, I didn't do anything, I'm your friend, like, it's, you know, I just tickled you, like, it's not anything dramatic. And like, she eventually got it out of me, and I just said, like, my step-granddad, like, he's been abusing me, like, he's been touching me. And she went, Lucy, I'm not having this, you need to tell your mum. I remember thinking, I said to her, please, no. And I remember crying. I was like, please don't tell my mum. I really don't want my mum to find out. And I think I was about 15, nearly 16. She went downstairs and she was like, either you tell my mum now, or I'm going to have to tell her, and she's going to have to tell your mum. And I was like, I can't tell her. So she went downstairs with our other friend who was there, and she went downstairs and they told them. And I remember just sitting there feeling so sick, like, oh my god, I'm going to be in so much trouble, what am I going to do? I don't know, like, my whole life's just come crashing beneath me. And I remember her mum came up, and I love her mum, I still love her mum to pieces. And I remember she just gave me the biggest hug, and she just said, it's okay, you're okay, I believe you. And then I just remember, like, her going, but I am going to have to tell your mum, but it's going to be okay, because I'm going to be there. She called my mum came over. I remember looking, and I could see my mum's face, and she was just, like, frozen. She looked so scared, and I was, like, so worried. I was like, oh my god, I'm going to be in so much trouble. And I think I said, please don't tell me off. And I remember she said, why the hell would I tell you off? She was just so shocked. She didn't know what to say. I remember she just cuddled me, and I just cried and cried. And then she called the police to kind of speak to me, and they were interrogating me, and they were really nice. And I didn't really want to tell them stories without someone being there. And I remember once they were just interrogating me, and we had the social services over, who made me feel like utter rubbish and an utter liar. So I think that just then set me back again. And I remember screaming at them, get out my house, I don't want to speak to you. I remember just storming out, and I ran so far. And I think my mum eventually came back, and I said to my mum, I don't want to speak to them, I just don't want to speak to them, they think I'm a liar. My real dad's side of the family, they never believed me, because they had this obsession that my mum wouldn't let me see my dad. But of course she wouldn't let me see my dad, for obvious reasons. He drank. Everyone was making us out to be liars, except from my mum and, like, my stepdad and, like, my friends. I was going to have to be going to court soon. And then I think the court kept getting pushed back. So it was getting really, really far down the line. So over time, obviously, like now, my brain is just slowly, like, wiping, like, the memories. My grandmother didn't believe her. She didn't even come and see her. It was just so heartbreaking. One of the reasons I didn't tell people was because I didn't want to ruin my, like, nan's life. She couldn't have cared less. She chose to stay with him. She stood with him in court, and I just remember, like, so you've got this like row of people who are obviously like the jury, I think it is, staring at you. I remember looking at the judge at one point as well, thinking, please just believe me, like, I'm not a liar. I've been told I'm a liar from the police, from the social services, because the police decided halfway through like the investigation that they just suddenly turned a bit on us. We kind of got forgotten about, like, after the case, like my whole family. It was kind of like, okay, you know, we don't care anymore. I remember, like, when I broke down in court, I was so upset, and I remember just feeling like no one believes me. And I had my boyfriend at the time, and there was a separate room, and my auntie. And I remember just going in there, I remember crying, going, no one believes me. They're calling me a liar. I said, I'm not a liar. I remember, like, they both come to me, and they gave me a chocolate bar, and they said, we believe you, just go and show them you're not a liar. So I went back and I held my head high, and I thought, I'm not going to go. I'm going to get through this. It's going to be over before I know it, and I'll never have to go through this again. When we got to the end, I remember, like, thinking I'd done so well and just feeling so deflated though. But I remember when we came out of court, I saw my abuser and my grandmother stood together, and she was cuddling him. And I just remember thinking, like, you just don't believe your grandchild over a man. And I remember that image has stuck with me, because that was the first time I actually realised she didn't believe me. And I remember we got home and I sat in the bed, and I remember, like, I just cuddled up to my teddy. I remember, like, my boyfriend came up and he came and checked on me. He said, are you okay? And I said, no. And I just cried, and he was like, would you like your mum? So I was like, yeah. We went and got my mum, and my mum was like, are you okay? Like, we don't have to talk about it. And I was like, no, I want to talk about it. I want to warn you, because there was one story that was in court and they lied. And I said, they lied about it. And I remember in court, they also said that the reason why he was cuddling me was because my boyfriend at the time had, like, broken up with me, and he hadn't. And I remember telling my mum the story, and I said, if they say this, can you please back me up, because they're saying I'm lying. They're saying I wasn't in a relationship, and I was. My mum's like, just don't worry about it. I'm going to go in and I'm going to sort it, and it's all going to be okay, and I've got you. It went on for, like, quite a while. The court dates actually kept getting pushed back. And I think it has been, like, God, I think either a year or 2 years, something like that. And I can't remember exactly. They eventually came and told us that he wasn't found guilty. And I just remember feeling so rubbish, because, like, how could he lie about this? And I've now got to live the rest of my life with this, like, guilt of feeling like, you know, I'm scared. I live 10 minutes down the road from my abuser. So I luckily went to uni for 4 years, and I got a bit of a break, so I didn't have to see him and that. And I remember when I came back from uni, I'd see him in his truck, and it was like I was a little girl again, and I'd, like, shrivel up and feel so, like, uncomfortable, like, oh my God, he's gonna kill me. I used to always have these fears, he's gonna kill me. I think I still slightly do have this fear that, like, he could just kill me. Like, he has nothing to lose. I think he had cancer during the time of the court. He was this big fat man when I was younger, and I remember he'd always say to me, oh, you're putting on weight, you're getting fat. And he'd always be like, you don't need a boyfriend when you have me. And I just kind of felt like that break at university brought me into a really, really strong person, because you have to live by yourself and you have to learn your own way. While I was at university, like, boys, like, the city I went to university was Norwich, where I did fashion design. And I just remember, like, these boys, like, they just touch you in the nightclubs. And I remember just feeling so sick. Like, it always ruined my night. Like, I never had a good night, ever. I remember I'd always just get so blackout drunk just to try and forget. I remember as well, like, while I was at university, my friend Like, he decided to put like extra drink in my drink, and I remember thinking like, why the hell has he done that? And it was to get me really drunk, and I remember passing out, and I remember just waking up and just feeling like so uneasy. And he did actually, and I just remember thinking, like, they just keep doing this, like, I'm just this object, I'm not a person. And this was like my best friend. I remember just thinking, right, this is just like, I can't go to the police about this. They don't believe you. There's not evidence. So what is the point? Like, I'm just going to have to just go on with my life. I really struggled in uni as well because I'd never really had dealt with my like issues. None of my uni friends really knew. I remember you have to then go and like think of what your next project's going to be and like what you're going to do and like what story am I going to tell through my fashion. I remember thinking, I love protests, I'm going to do it about Black Lives Matter. But then there was this day, and I just thought, but this isn't my story. I do have passion towards this, but not the passion someone who goes through this racist, goes through. I need to think of something else to go through because, And then I remember there was a case that came through and it became really powerful, and it was the Sarah Everard, I think that's how you say her name, where she got murdered and raped. Oh my God. It was like it sparked something. I thought, oh my God, this is my chance to tell my story and let the world know. So I remember I wrote it all up and I did some designs and I thought, right, I'm just going to do this. I don't know how I'm going to do it. And I remember I went into uni and we had changed teachers, and I remember I went up to him and I remember I went, I'm going to do it about abuse. And he was like, okay, that sounds really cool. Like, that's exciting. Like, let's see where we can go with this. Right, I'm going to get a jacket and I'm going to just paint. I'm just going to paint on it and just have a little thing. And I thought, I'm just going to put all my quotes. I'm going to put on some music. It was a bit like therapy, and I felt like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, I feel like I can actually speak. I remember I went into uni and I showed my teacher and he was like, this is amazing. I don't think you should use any digital print to print these words on or like screen printing. He was like, I think you should do it all by hand. It is like you're at a protest. I actually feel like I'm somewhere getting there with uni. Like, I'm finally in my final year and I actually know what I want to do. And then I just came up with this idea, this silhouette of this massive puffer jacket, because I wanted this idea of, when you're a child and you put on your mum's clothes, they're like massive on you. And I wanted that idea of it being so oversized, like it just looks absolutely ridiculous. And I just remember having this idea, right, I want something really bright in your face that you will not miss. So I thought pink. It's my favourite colour. I'm going to have to do it. It's got to be pink. Let's just do it. And I remember I hadn't really told anyone at uni what I was really doing. And I remember I just was like, right, I'm just going to do it. I just started painting on it. And I got to the point of where I've written all these stories out of myself that I want. Still had so much blank canvas on the puff jacket. And I remember I wrote up a little survey and I put it on Facebook and Instagram. And I remember I said, if you've been and you want to speak out, I'd love you to be included in my fashion. Your identity and everything will always be safe with me. I will never tell anyone your story that it's you. It did okay, it was quite amazing. I remember this girl reaching out to me and she said she went camping with her friends and her friends trapped her or something along those lines in this tent with this boy, and he basically just assaulted her and they were all laughing in the tent next to her. I remember sitting there and I was crying my eyes out reading the story. A few weeks went on, I managed to get a few more stories, and I remember this girl reaching out to me. I think she was 11 or something like that, and she got raped by 5 men. And I just remember crying reading her story, and I just thought, oh my God, this is just horrendous. This is happening to so many people. But all these stories add up and they make, you know, these strong, powerful people. And then she said, like, have you ever thought about like reaching out to a charity? And I was thinking, like, never thought about that. And so she was like, oh, this is the charity that I worked with, like when I went through my abuse. And I remember reaching out to them and I said to them, like, hey, like, is there any chance that I could work with you guys? I remember they like messaged me and I was in class and I was like, oh my God, like someone's actually interested. And they said, we would love to be a part of this. And I said, there'll be nothing that will give anyone's identity. It's all private. And I just feel like I had this idea of having balaclavas on. I didn't want anyone's face to be seen originally. And this charity was so lovely. I remember we set up a Zoom call and I got through to this lady called Hannah, and she like told me the most amazing like things about this charity. And I remember like we came up with this idea of we're going to have like letters that these children had written to their abusers, but they don't ever get sent to their abusers, but it's just like what I want to write to my abuser, but I can't. She eventually like sent me this list of all these things, and I remember like I started reading it and I had to just shut my laptop, had to walk out because it was so horrific. Remember I went back and I said, no, like you're not this person, you're a strong person, you can do this, you can tell these children stories because they haven't had the chance. You can tell the world all these people's stories. I remember like getting this like outfit. I remember just like writing on it, and I came across this one quote. It said, little girls are supposed to feel safe with their daddies. And it just like really stuck with me, and I was like, that is going to be the quote of this outfit, because that is going to be the main one that I really want everyone to look at, because that is so shocking. I remember I'd like put it up, and like everyone in uni was just like, wow, this is amazing. And I just remember this page shared it, and it was like on their website, and like I was just like, oh my God, people are so like interested in my work, like I'm like helping so many people. And I think like the whole thing was kind of a bit of like therapy for me, but I didn't really tell anyone at uni that the reason I was doing the collection was actually really because I had been abused. I was still a little bit secretive about it, which is like crazy because I was doing this massive big thing where I was like shouting about it in a sense. So the charity is called Brave Futures, and they're based in Suffolk, England, and they are an amazing charity, and I really don't think I would have got through this if it wasn't for them, because I get to speak out at their events. We all get to speak out and our voices are actually heard, and that's all I've ever wanted from me doing this collection. Yeah, and I feel like that is my story.